This is the oldest human burial ever found in North America, a baby boy, dead at 18 months, laid to rest 12,600 years ago with tools that no one alive knows how to make. For 45 years, he was locked in a storage box, too fragile to study, too controversial to ignore. Then a team of geneticists extracted his DNA, and what they found didn't just rewrite history. It ended a scientific war that had been raging for a century. This is the story of the Anzac child. Wilsall, Montana, 1968. Two construction workers, Mel Anzac and Ben Hargis, are moving earth with heavy equipment on private land near a cliff face when their machinery cuts into something that shouldn't be there. Bone, stone, and everywhere, a deep, blood-red powder. What they had uncovered was staggering. More than 100 stone and bone artifacts, all deliberately placed and coated in red ochre, a mineral pigment used in sacred burial rituals across the ancient world. And the tools were unmistakable. The razor-sharp, fluted projectile points of the Clovis culture, the most distinctive early technological tradition ever found in North America. But the artifacts weren't alone. Nestled among them were the fragile remains of a child, a boy, no older than 2, wrapped in ochre like a second skin. The care with which these objects were arranged spoke not of survival, but of reverence, of grief. This wasn't a hunting camp. This was a funeral. The red ochre, a symbol of blood, life, and rebirth found in burials on every inhabited continent, confirmed it. Whoever laid this infant into the Montana earth over 12 millennia ago had taken the time to make the moment sacred, as if marking a passage from this world into another. But almost immediately, something about this site didn't add up, and the mystery it created would take nearly half a century to solve. Here's where it gets complicated. The trouble started with the dates. Early radiocarbon testing produced results that flatly contradicted each other. The Clovis artifacts, the stone points, the antler foreshafts appeared to be older than the child's bones, in some analyses, by hundreds of years. How could a baby be buried with weapons from before he was even born? And there was another complication that most people never hear about. The Anzac site didn't contain one set of human remains. It contained 2. A second individual, now called Anzac II, was found at the site and later dated to roughly 8,600 years ago, thousands of years younger than the Clovis tools. The presence of 2 burials from radically different time periods in the same location muddied every conclusion. Had the layers been scrambled by ancient floods? Burrowing animals? Had the 2 burials been mixed together? The site's discoverers were not professional archaeologists. They hadn't mapped the exact position of each artifact, a critical detail that was now lost forever. The Anzac burial, once a symbol of discovery, became a problem, a tantalizing clue that scientists couldn't fully trust. The bones were placed in storage too precious and fragile to risk analyzing with the destructive methods available at the time. And for decades, the central question hung in the air, unanswered. Was this a genuine Clovis burial, the only one ever found? Or just an archaeological accident? But the answer to the Anzac puzzle would take decades and an entirely new science to arrive. And to understand why anyone cared this much about one baby in one hillside, you need to understand the war that was already raging over who got here first. Rewind to the 1930s. Near the town of Clovis, New Mexico, archaeologists found something that changed everything. Razor-sharp stone spear points embedded directly alongside mammoth bones. It was the first undeniable proof that humans had hunted megafauna in North America during the last ice age. The Clovis culture had been found. Their technology was extraordinary. Their reach was continental Clovis. Points had been found from coast to coast, from Canada to Venezuela. And for most of the 20th century, one theory dominated: the Clovis first model. The idea was straightforward. Around 13,000 years ago, a group of hunter-gatherers walked from Siberia into Alaska, across a land bridge exposed by low sea levels. They moved south through a narrow, ice-free corridor between the Great Glaciers and became the founding population of the Americas. Clovis tools were their signature, and the theory held that nothing came before them. It was clean, it was elegant, and it was wrong. Starting in the 1970s and accelerating through the 2000s, archaeologists began unearthing sites that were older than Clovis. Monte Verde in Chile, the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, Footprints preserved in white gypsum at White Sands, New Mexico, dated to over 21,000 years ago. Each discovery was fought over bitterly, but the cumulative weight became impossible to ignore. People were already here long before the first Clovis point was ever napped. The Clovis first model was cracking. But a second question remained, and this one was even more explosive. Around 12,700 years ago, the Clovis culture simply stops. Their distinctive tools vanish from the archaeological record, replaced by new, regional styles. What happened? Did they die out? Were they replaced by a different population? Or did they simply change, their culture evolving into the societies that followed? And lurking beneath all of this was a deeply uncomfortable theory, one that had more to do with modern politics than ancient science. It was called the Solutrean hypothesis. The idea, promoted by a small number of researchers, was that the Clovis people hadn't come from Siberia at all. Instead, they had crossed the Atlantic from Ice Age Europe, specifically from the Silurian culture of what is now France and Spain, bringing their stone tool technology with them. The hypothesis was never mainstream. Most archaeologists rejected it on the basis of chronology, geography, and the enormous gaps in the evidence. But it persisted in popular media, in part because it carried an unmistakable subtext. If Europeans were the first Americans, then indigenous peoples' claims to deep ancestry on this continent could be questioned. The debate needed hard evidence, not more tools, not more theories. It needed DNA, and there was exactly one burial in the world that could provide it. One set of Clovis-era human remains, one chance to answer the question definitively: the Anzac child. By the early 2010s, the science had finally caught up with the ambition. Advances in ancient DNA recovery meant that researchers could now sequence a complete genome from just a few milligrams of bone powder. A team led by Danish geneticist Eske Willerslev prepared to attempt something that had never been done: extract and decode the full genetic blueprint of a Clovis individual. But before they touched the bones, they paused. These were not specimens. They were the remains of someone's child and ancestor. In a step that was groundbreaking in its own right, Willerslev's team sought consultation and guidance from Native American tribal communities across Montana. Shane Doyle, a member of the Apsalaluk the Crow Nation and a professor of Native American studies, became a key figure in bridging the worlds of Western science and indigenous knowledge. Balancing the promise of discovery with the duty of respect, the study went forward. A tiny piece of the child's skull was sampled. For weeks, the work was painstaking. Ancient DNA is degraded, fragmented, contaminated by millennia of microbial activity. Every step required extraordinary precision. And then, after more than 12,000 years of silence, a genome began to emerge. The first results left no room for doubt. The DNA was contemporaneous with the Clovis tools. Anzacuan was not a later intrusion. The conflicting radiocarbon dates from decades earlier had been artifacts of imprecise early methods and confusion caused by the presence of the younger Anzac II burial. The bones and the tools belonged together. This was a true Clovis burial, untouched and intact. The 45-year debate was over. But that only answered what the site was. The DNA could now answer who. When the genome was fully decoded, the results were unambiguous. The Anzac child's genetic ancestry traced directly and overwhelmingly to Siberia and East Asia. There was no European component. None. The Solutrean hypothesis, already rejected by most researchers, was now decisively contradicted by the hardest evidence in science: the DNA of the only Clovis individual ever tested. But the most extraordinary finding wasn't about where the Clovis people came from. It was about where they went. The Anzac child's genome showed a direct, unbroken ancestral connection to modern indigenous peoples across the Western Hemisphere. The closest genetic match? Not populations in North America, but communities in Central and South America. The conclusion was inescapable. The Clovis people had not vanished. They were not a lost race. They were not replaced by later arrivals. They were the ancestors. Their bloodline had continued for over 12,000 years, flowing through generations, through the rise and fall of countless cultures, through European contact and colonization, through everything unbroken. For many indigenous communities, the genome study was not a revelation. It was a vindication. Their oral histories had always spoken of deep, ancient roots in this land, roots that stretched back to the beginning. For centuries, those traditions had been dismissed, romanticized, or ignored by Western academia. Now, the most advanced genetic science on Earth had arrived at the same conclusion that indigenous peoples had carried in their stories all along. Western science hadn't made a discovery. It had finally caught up with ancient memory. The implications rippled outward in every direction. The pre-Clovis archaeological sites had already cracked the timeline, proving that people reached the Americas long before the Clovis culture emerged. But the Anzic genome delivered the final blow to a different myth entirely. The idea that the Clovis people were a separate, vanished population with no living descendants. Clovis was not a beginning. It was not an ending. It was a chapter of brilliant flourishing of a people who were already well established on the continent, and whose lineage would continue for millennia to come. One small skeleton from a Montana hillside had reconnected the ancient past to the living present. The Anzic child, designated Anzic I in the scientific literature, became one of the most important human remains ever studied, the keystone in a bridge between 12,000 years of history and the people who carry that history in their cells today. And the story has one final chapter. In June of 2014, after the genetic study was published and the results shared with tribal representatives, the Anzic child was returned to the earth. In a ceremony attended by members of multiple tribal nations, led in part by Shane Doyle of the Crow Nation, the boy was reburied on the Anzic property close to where he had first been laid to rest over 12,000 years before. His DNA had traveled through laboratories in Denmark, through sequencing machines and computational models, through peer review and public debate. It had crossed oceans of data and centuries of academic argument. And in the end, it had confirmed what the people of this land had always known. They had been here since the beginning. The Anzic child gave a voice to an entire people, proving that history is not always a story of endings, but of transformation. The first Americans were never a mystery to be solved. They were a family connected across time by the unbroken thread of their DNA. And their story, one of the greatest survival epics in human history, was never truly lost. It was waiting in a silent grave on a Montana hillside for the moment it could finally be heard.